Hi there. I welcome you. I would say good morning, but I'm not sure exactly when you're going to be watching this. So I hope that you're having a good day, and I hope that you're able to get something out of what we're going to be discussing, because I believe that listening is one of the most important skills that you can develop. Some people, as we talked about in our last class, some people have a natural ability to do some things, and some people seem to be prone to be able to listen really well. But for others, it becomes very, very difficult. And so what we want to try to do today is to learn how can we listen, but also the importance of listening, especially in the field of communication, because so often it is the cause of so many problems that it is really intriguing and infuriating at times. One of the stories that I find is interesting is the story of Cassandra and Apollo in Greek mythology. Most people aren't aware of this story. It's one of those lesser ones, and it has many different tellings as far as what the story goes. But essentially, Cassandra was known as a beautiful woman. And the Greek god Apollo, who's associated with the sun, would look down upon her and found her beauty to be intoxicating in many ways. As he watched her, he finally decided that he wanted to meet her. He began to court her to try to do what he could to win her love. And so after he had attempted this for a while, he thought that if he could give her a gift that would be so valuable that she would appreciate him and love him for what he had shared with him. In some ways, it's kind of like a bribe, but in romance, things like that happen. It's like giving flowers, except for a Greek god, it's a little bit bigger. So he decided to give her the gift of being able to know the future. Now, if you think about that, that would be a nice gift to be able to know what's your grade going to be in this class at the end of the semester. Do you know what the winning lotto numbers are in the Powerball? All these different types of things would be handy and be very helpful. And yet at the same time, the reality is that she received this gift and was delighted by it, but she also recognized that she really didn't love Apollo. And so while he attempted to woo her and romance her and win her love, he was never able to do that, and she finally rejected him. When she did, he became so incensed. He was infuriated, but he was kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. As a Greek god, he could not take that gift back to know the future, but he could give her another one. And this was the gift he gave her, that no one would believe what she said. And so from that time forward, after she spurned Apollo, she could tell people what was going to happen, but no one would believe her. They just simply laughed at her. What does it have to do with listening? Well, I don't know about you, but there's probably been a time when someone doesn't really listen to you. If you can imagine for Cassandra, such as the Battle of Troy, in which with the Trojan horse, it's said in some of the stories and the way that this is told, she was there. She tried to warn the people about the horse that was filled with soldiers, and that this was not a gift to honor their God, but it was actually a trap. But no one would listen to her. People laughed at her. They wouldn't hear what she had to say. They just thought she was crazy. Over time, this ate away at her, and again, depending upon the version of the story, they all kind of come down to this. She became so discouraged and so depressed because people would not pay attention to what she had to tell them. They wouldn't believe her, that ultimately she became so despondent and so discouraged, her life in many ways just shriveled up, and ultimately she died. I don't know how you feel that way. I think there are times that we all have found that people don't listen to us, and it can be highly aggravating, frustrating. Think back to a time when someone didn't listen to you. Do you remember how that made you feel? Do you remember the frustration? You had something important to say, but they just wouldn't pay attention. Kind of like Cassandra. She knew what the future was, but people would not listen to her. We all go through that. Listening is so important because it does lift us up. If people do not listen to you, you don't feel valued. You don't feel important. The difficulty is sometimes we have even a hard time figuring out what exactly is listening as opposed to hearing. And so I want to kind of set up some parameters so you understand what I'm talking about whenever we discuss this. From a scholarly perspective, what's the difference between hearing something and listening to something? Well, from a scholarly aspect, whenever they study this, hearing has to do with the actual physical act of hearing. In other words, it has to do with your ability to listen and your eardrums functioning and those relating the messages to your brain. It has more to do with audiology, or like hearing, being able to hear the noise and make that out, than it does with actually being able to understand or listen. Listen has much more resonance. It's that idea that you hear and you're able to respond, that you grasp what's being said, that you choose to listen. We'll talk more about these different steps, but all of that is important to that. There really is an importance to listening. As a child, you learn to speak. You learn to express yourself. The way that you learn first as a child is by listening. In fact, oral history has existed longer than written history. People would tell stories to remember, to be taught by. And that's part of how you learn. And it's been a reliable methodology of charting history and keeping track of it. But the importance is, do you really hear, do you really listen to what's being said? There's an importance to that, because it is the chief method by which you're going to by which you're going to learn, both from the standpoint of what you hear, but what you see. Listening involves vision as well as your ears, and what you read as well. You listen in that regard. Again, as I've mentioned in the class before, my oldest brother had cerebral palsy, which meant in the way in which he was born, he was not able to speak, he was not able to walk, he was not able to control his motor functions. Mentally, he was still sharp. He understood things. He couldn't communicate through vocals, but he could through his vision. And we learned to listen to him by the directions that he would look. In my lifetime, he lived to be 26, and he was 6 years older than me. In 20 years, I never heard him say a word, and yet we had many conversations because I listened to him. Well, listening involves nonverbal as well as verbal. And yet in many ways, whenever we talk about listening, we don't really think about it. We kind of think as listening is very similar to breathing. I mean, most of you probably never took a class on how to breathe when you were a child. It's not like you were born and the doctor took you and they began, okay, as a baby, you now need to take a breath. Please take a breath. Please. They didn't do that. Most of us, we just got a swat, which hurt, and we cried out and we began to breathe. Well, that's kind of the way that we listen as well. Even before you're born, there's research that would demonstrate you're able to respond to the sounds. You listen and you hear sounds. You don't understand what those sounds are as a baby in the womb, but you still hear those. And so with that, you respond to loud noises, but they've also done studies that demonstrate that even music, a baby can hear before it's born. The voice and tones of the mother and the father who speaks, they begin to be accustomed to those tones so that even after they're born, they begin to hear. See, we don't really think about breathing. We just do it. And in many ways, that's the way we think of listening. We don't really think about it. We just listen. And yet we're not very good at it quite frequently. In the same way, we're not always very good about breathing. They've done studies to show that most of us really don't breathe correctly. That sounds so strange. I'm alive, how could I not be breathing correctly? Well, research has shown that breathing can have an incredible effect on your body. It can lower your blood pressure. I was watching a channel for old television shows, and they had a demonstration of a new product that you could buy. And what this product would do is you strapped it to your chest, you put air hoses in your nose, and you followed an app on your phone, and it would tell you how to breathe. Their guarantee was, if you did this 15 minutes a day, within a month's time, you would be able to lower your blood pressure. And they had evidence that it worked. That's not too surprising. We understand that for years. Through meditation and mindfulness, we understand that just concentrating on how you breathe can calm you. In fact, a Stanford neurologist recently came out in just the last couple of weeks with a study that shows that if you are breathing correctly, it can eliminate, according to his study, anxiety. You don't have to worry if you breathe right. As I shared with some of the classes, the reality is as well, whenever you're going to give birth, my wife, whenever she was going to give birth, we have 4 children, we went to classes that would teach her how to breathe through the process of giving birth. And it helped. It helped her relax to the point she fell asleep in between the contractions. And I had to wake her up so she would know there was a contraction coming. Otherwise, she might have slept through it. She would not have slept through it. And she didn't need me to wake her up. But it helps reduce anxiety. It helps calm you. Even in exercise, they teach you how to train, how to breathe. If you're running a long distance, you learn certain patterns of breathing. If you're working out with weights, you inhale, you exhale, based upon whether you are lifting or lowering a weight. And you're feeding yourself oxygen to help you, and then you're relaxing as you are working out. Well, listening can be taught, just like breathing can. And if you learn how to listen, it can actually reduce your anxiety and worry because you hear what's going on. And you don't have to create drama in your mind because, well, what are they saying? Do they mean this? That's all part of it sometimes. It can help reduce that anxiety and worry. It lowers drama, and it gives you better understanding of people, what motivates them, what drives them, what troubles them. I mean, in interpersonal communication, that is such a powerful thing. If you are a speaker, to be able to understand your audience and what they're dealing with. Even though you may be generalizing based upon their demographics, you still have a sense for some of the things that they struggle with. And that can make you a better and more effective speaker. It can also give you influence. People who are in sales and in business, they would tell you, if you listen, you're more likely to have influence and be able to have more sales, to be able to create more connections because you listen, because you pay attention, because you're making them valuable because you're listening to them. So that's important. To learn how to listen can be very beneficial. Now, this is something I'm not real sure you can see this well. This is the image of a Chinese word. I'm not a Chinese linguist, but from what I understand and what I've looked at, this is the symbol for listening. And in it, it is made up of a multiple number of symbols that are joined together to create the symbol for listening. It involves the ear. Well, if you're going to listen, if you have ears, you should hear. But you should listen as well as just being able to hear the audio of things. There's you. You're involved in listening. Do you take time to listen? Or are you too busy? Sometimes we don't want to listen. We make choices that way. There are the eyes, because listening involves the eyes. A good speaker understands the value of nonverbal communication and gestures and movement. It's the same thing in interpersonal communication and small group communication. You understand how you move and how the look on your face, the nuances of facial expressions can tell you a lot if you're listening to have the nonverbals as well. There's undivided attention. Really listening means you're giving someone your attention. And that can be hard because you're surrendering some sense of control because you're giving them the attention. And yet when you do that, you're also giving them value. And that's important. There's the heart. Well, if you're listening to somebody, it gives you the opportunity to have compassion because you understand what they're going through. You've taken time to hear them, to hear their pain and their sorrow. There's this idea of the king, and with that, it carries with the idea that you are mentally involved. You have the power to help, to listen, to be aware, and to take the steps to help. I think there's a lot of that aspects that we talk about from this symbol that tie into what listening truly is for us. And I think that's important. There's an importance to listening. During the pandemic of 2020, businesses moved to Zoom, to Skype, to Microsoft Teams and things of that nature because they wanted to have the facial ability. Because writing alone didn't capture all the understanding that was necessary. And we talk about, should you text a breakup? No, because it's better to do that face to face. Whenever you're talking with someone, often that face to face ability, we're doing this because I can't be there with you. If I could be there, I could see your reactions even more. But as it is, I'm trying to make sure that I'm attentive to what's going on, and I'm hoping that you can understand what I'm saying, that you're listening. So that's the goal. But that was a part of the effects of the pandemic. We moved to the video system, which in doing public speaking, in presentations, in business, and other things, more and more is being done that way. Even with my family coffee business, I have a daughter in Seattle, a daughter that's in San Diego, and whenever we get together on a weekly basis, we're all on Microsoft Teams talking to one another, seeing one another, which is nice because it helps eliminate some confusion, but also it's just nice to see their face. And that's one of the joys. That's why FaceTime and things like that have value, because you do get a chance to see each other. And as a child, as you learn to speak and to express yourself, well, that becomes a part of what you learn as well. And you continue to learn that, to understand. I mean, my mother, if she arched her eyebrow in the right way, I knew I was in trouble. She didn't even have to call me Michael. I knew I was in trouble. Those are the nuances that can be taken place and that you can understand through listening non-verbally as well as what you hear. And there are times, some jokes, if you just hear what's said, you don't get it's a joke. But if you look at the face, you understand they're kidding, and that's valuable as well. There's also an importance from the standpoint of business. Business leaders in Fortune 500 companies, according to the Harvard Business Review, estimate that 86% of workplace problems come from people not listening or understanding or being afraid to ask questions because they're afraid people won't listen to them. And that creates an organizational communication logjam that people can't get past sometimes. And so mistakes are made because they don't really pay attention. They've got other things in their mind. They're doing other things. They just don't listen to their bosses. That's why listening is important, even in business. And don't be afraid to ask for an explanation. Sometimes bosses don't want to tell you. They don't want to listen to what questions you have. But again, that's an issue that's going to affect the organization. Listening is also important in another way, just so you know. According to the book, Words and How They Influence Your Brain, a study that was done, that Mark Waldman counts in that book, a study at UCLA showed that students ranked someone who listens to them as the greatest personal skill in relationships. It was essential. If you really like somebody, listen to them. You're giving them value. And as we talk about what that listening involves, you're taking time to be able to understand who they are, what they're going through. And that's important. It helps us. The issue is sometimes there are power or politics that come into play with listening as well, which is sad. In general, speaking is thought to be a position of authority. I'm your professor. You have to listen to me. I'm speaking with authority. I have the ethos to tell you. And so sometimes that becomes a power issue. That's why sometimes bosses don't want to have to explain things too much. They're in power. Do what I say and just leave it at that. Don't question me. And because listening is seen as a position of subservience. You're lesser. You don't know as much. You don't have the authority or the power that I do, so you just need to listen to me. That dynamic can be difficult and really dangerous in interpersonal situations. As a speaker, you want to be aware. Yes, you're going to be speaking, and you should be able to create that sense of authority, that sense of ethos, that sense of credibility. But at the same time, be aware and listen to the audience as you watch them. There's that process of communication in which there's a give and take. Be aware of that. Speakers at times need to give instructions, and listeners may need to be told, But that's not the end of the politics. There's a difference. There is a great difference between what you want to say and what people hear. Listening helps you know what people need and where they are. I remember years ago I had a professor who always used to say the problem with a lot of what we hear and about the communication that takes place in marriages and other things is this. There's what you want to say. There's what you say. There's what you think you said. There's what you think they heard. And then on the other side, the person you're speaking to, well, there's what they hear. There's what they think you said. There's what they think you mean. Those are a lot of obstacles, a lot of things to get through. That's why taking the time to listen and even being able to ask questions to clarify things can eliminate so many problems in relationships, in business relationships, just taking the time to do that. And that's important. It's hard to give directions to somebody if you don't know where they are. It's hard to speak to somebody if you don't know what they're dealing with. For me to get up in front of the class like this, and for me to talk about the new policies that are a part of Medicare for those who are retiring, that's not really going to interest you. I could elucidate upon it. I could tell you a lot of stuff about that, although I don't have experience, but that's not going to do you any good. I'm not helping you. And I really do, as a speaker, my goal is to help you, to serve you as much as I can. So whenever we look at this, hearing is more or less involuntary. It's effortless, doesn't require a lot of effort, it just happens. And sometimes it can be accidental. But listening means that you've taken the time to focus in on somebody. It means that you're choosing to do that, and it's intentional. When you come into a class and you choose to listen to your professor, you're making an intentional choice to hear and listen to what they have to say, to take it in, to evaluate it, to think about it. And that's all important. Okay? There is a common misperception that in public speaking, that speaking is the most important part. It turns out critical active listening is just as important as effective speaking. And yet there are things that may distract us from being able to really be able to understand what we hear and what we are trying to listen to within the framework of this. Here are some things that can take place that will cause some issues. One is cognitive factors. Okay? This has to do with your intelligence, with your curiosity, which I think sometimes is a good thing to have whenever you're listening, to have a curiosity about people, about things, about how you infer things and understand things and process things, and the ability to concentrate. If you're walking into a class at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and you've had a class at 8, you've had a class at 9:30, you have classes all day, you get to that last class or you have a night class, and it's time for you to listen to all this information, cognitively, you're tired. And it's hard for you to have the energy to really listen. You have to really work hard in that regard because the cognitive factors of listening, you're weary. It's harder to focus, harder to take that in because you've done it for so long. There's language-related factors. If you're an individual that has learned English as a second language and you're listening to somebody in that language, that can be difficult because you may not understand all of those words. But it's not just as a second language. People use different expressions, you know? I mean, and even though we may have a sense for what they are, there are some words that are hard. If I use the term, hey man, that's really groovy, I remember as a small child, that was one of the words that was around. But you know what? You don't hear that anymore. If I said that to a group of older adults, no problem. They would get what I was talking about. But and maybe from the standpoint of your age, you may get that as well because that's a word that's been around for a while and people still have a sense for that. But do you understand the language that is being used? That can be a challenge. If I was to talk to you about plumbing, if you have no experience in plumbing, you're not going to understand a thing. In fact, Steve Martin, the actor who used to be a stand-up comedian, in one of his recordings in which he did the song King Tut, which became very popular for a while, was a farcical song. But on that album that he had, one of his comedy bits was where he was in a situation where he was doing a stand-up routine, and he said, "I hear we got a lot of plumbers here today." And he tells a joke that plumbers would get. Nobody else would. It was really dry in that sense. And I enjoyed that, but a lot of people just, why is he doing this? Well, knowing your audience, it would fit. But do you understand the language that's being used? Can you identify the main ideas? Do you understand the size of the vocabulary that's being used? There's also speaker-related issues. How effective is the speaker? It's funny because on this slide here, I don't know if you can see it or not, it says sneaker, a little misspell there. But, how effective is that speaker? Are they able to communicate their ideas? Can they hold your attention? Do you appreciate this speaker? If you like a speaker, you'll listen to him more. That's why it helps to be likable as a speaker, because people want to hear you. That's why, a good story can create that connection where people want to hear you. But how you speak can cause people to listen to you, but it can also cause people to not listen to you. So you have to be cautious that way. There are contextual factors. What's the environment? I've taught in classrooms before where somebody was mowing the lawn right outside the window as I'm trying to teach. Not the best environment. Okay? If the other day in one of my classes, the air conditioner was on so loud, it was crazy. There are these kind of, the context, the environment may feed into the difficulty in listening as well. There may be noises, the distractions, things of that nature. And so also are you interested in the subject? Do you care about it? That's going to help you listen as well. All of those things. Even the speaker's fatigue might come into it, or the listener's fatigue. Are you tired? Did you get a good night's sleep? That's going to affect whether or not you hear very well. There's also demographic factors. What is the person that you're listening to? Are they male? Are they female? Are they what's that way? Because sometimes that can affect how you listen. Some would say your parents' occupation. What did they demonstrate to you? Was it part of their job? Was it something they did at home? If you achieved in high school, you tend to listen better because that's part of how you've learned. All of those things, according to Nichols and Ralph Nichols, who studied, one of the first guys who really studied listening, he would say that all of those things are factors in whether or not we're able to listen and understand what's being said. But how can you tell if people are listening? Sometimes that's one of the big challenges. I've surveyed classes before just to say, how do you know if someone is listening to you? This is kind of the process of listening, okay? It might be something interesting. If we were in class, I'd take the time to say, how do you know? I would take a survey from you. How do you know? Part of the process of listening is preparing to listen. Whenever you turned on this video, you already had a mindset of whether or not you wanted to hear what was being said. This is an assignment, I've got to listen to it, or this could be interesting. Could be a number of things. How prepared were you to listen? When you walk into a classroom, are you prepared to listen? Sometimes when you get home, if you live with your parents and they want to start talking to you, you really don't want to hear about taking out the garbage and about how your room needs to be cleaned. You just really don't want to There are those things that factor into it. Are you preparing yourself to listen? And that's why sometimes, I've talked with married couples before where it's like, you need to schedule a time every day where you can turn off the TV, turn off your phones, and just take time to listen to one another. It allows you to have that time set apart, and you'll be prepared. Can you hear? We talked about how that has to do with the actual physical ability to hear. Can you hear what's being said? If you're sitting in the back of a big classroom, you may not be able to hear comments that the other people in your class are making. Well, how do you try to deal with that? Can you hear what's being said? That's part of the physical process of that. Sometimes, whenever it comes to understanding and interpreting, there may be expectations or biases that get in the way. We don't really understand, or we interpret things because of what we think or what we expect people to say or expect people to do. Even in relationships, that can take place, which can be very, very difficult in a lot of ways. There is a New York marriage counselor that Katie Murphy, in her book on Are You Listening to Me, talks about it's kind of like a confirmation bias, but it's almost more of an intimacy bias. I know this person so well. I know what they're thinking. I know how they're going to respond. What she finds is that whenever she has a couple that comes in for counseling, she may ask a question and one spouse wants to answer all the questions. Part of that may be a control issue, but also part of it, they think they know what the other person's going to say. And let me tell you, whenever it comes to relationships, whether it's parental or spousal or dating, people will surprise you. So you've got to be cautious. Can you comprehend what they're saying? Can you translate it so that you grasp it in your understanding? Can you translate it and process it and assign meaning? What does this mean? Is it valuable? How does this affect me? And what's being meant to be said? Can I grasp this? Can I interpret it? And then there's a process whereby you apply it. Can you figure out what's being said? Does it fit to your life? Is it something that's going to be beneficial in your persuasion speeches? Does what they're saying really apply to my life? If they're talking about something that has nothing to do with me, the application of what's being said to my life or to your life, if I'm going to be compassionate, that's going to be a part of it. One of the things that I think sometimes as we evaluate that and we understand that and we do the application, remembering is a big part of listening as well. Because whenever you remember, and there's two aspects of memory. There's short-term and there's long-term. Okay, short-term is that what you remember from today. Long-term is what you've invested more thought in and you're able to remember it. Studies that you have. If there's an interesting topic, I've known guys who could quote you statistics from John Elway's passing career while he was with the Denver Broncos. That's long-term memory. He hasn't played for a long time. They still remember that because they invested the time to make it part of their long-term memory. And taking things from short-term memory, what you hear or what you listen to at that time, and move that into long-term memory is part of listening, but it's also a part of remembering and a part of learning. And if you can remember what people say, they know you listened. That's part of the value of remembering somebody's name. You've given them value because you've listened and you remembered. If you can remember some of the things that they've said, some of the things that they've done, all of those things have value. So that's a part of remembering, is an aspect of listening as well. And then there's the response. How do you respond? You've listened to somebody, you've heard what they had to say, you were prepared to listen, you understand what they say, you've interpreted what they said, you evaluate to figure out how it fits in your life, you're remembering what they said, and then you're asking a question. You're responding in some way that they're going to know you listened. Because you have. You've heard what they had to say. You've been able to understand the concepts they were trying to communicate, and now you may want clarification, but even that, a good question is so valuable because it demonstrates you've heard. You want to understand more. You want to understand better. That can be very, very helpful. There's an old adage. Whenever it comes to your presentations, whenever it comes to speaking, or even in conversations, talk in such a way people will listen, but listen so people will want to hear what you have to say. You gain credibility by listening. You gain authority by taking the time to hear what they have to say. And it becomes, and there are some things whenever it comes to neuro-linguistic programming and other things of that nature, they would tell you if you listen and you ask questions and such, you earn. They owe you, and they will feel that they owe you. It's kind of a reciprocal kind of persuasion. If I give you this bottle of water, you're more likely to pay attention to me. If I listen to you, you're more likely to listen to me. And it works that way. Okay, so how do we learn to be a more effective listener? One, prepare yourself. That's so important. Second, do it. Listen. Third, think about what you've listened to. And four, respond. Those are all steps. How do you prepare? What noise do you have around you? What do you need to eliminate? There is always noise around us. And what we tend to do is that we filter what we hear. Sometimes we can do that in conversations as well, and we don't really pay attention or hear what someone is saying. How do we prepare? There's physical things that are around us that can distract us, physical noise. Well, we've got to be aware of that. Barking dogs, loud music, air conditioners, airplanes, noisy conflict nearby. If you're in the dorm and the roommates in the room next to you are having it out, you may hear that, even though you don't want to. It's there. You learn. Psychologically, are you prepared to listen? I mean, are you worrying about other things? Are you worrying about money? You know, are you worrying about the deadlines for papers and classes and speeches and things that you've got to get done? Are there other people in the room that somehow affect you in how you think? Maybe because you're attracted to them, or maybe because you dislike them or have an issue with them, and that becomes a distraction. You're not really prepared. Sometimes it's just you have such a tight schedule. You've only got so much time. You know, even in watching this video, you've only got so much time that you want to watch and invest on this video. I understand that. You know, sometimes it's a bias. I don't like what they're talking about. That really irritates me. I don't like their opinion. And so we're not prepared to listen because we've built these barriers. I always kind of think of attitudes and biases. Those are kind of like bouncers in your head. They let ideas in and let ideas out. Well, sometimes they'll keep you from listening because of the attitudes that you have or biases. Sometimes it's psychological noise or physiological noise. Maybe you don't feel good. You know, maybe you're kind of ill, you're under the weather, you have a headache. Maybe you're really hungry and it's just hard to listen. So be prepared. Prepare yourself for that. And sometimes it's semantic noise because of the special vocabulary that's being used, those types of things like we talked about, the vocabulary and such. All of that can factor into it. Okay? One of the things as a listener, if you're preparing, be aware of attention spans. There is a study done at one time that said that human beings have the attention span of a goldfish. It was poor research, and it's been shown that it's really not true. But we do understand that the ability for us to focus and concentrate on things becomes very, very difficult. We're very used to short, brief messages. You know, hey, with a text, you've only got so many characters. And so they expanded it, but it's still, we're used to those brief things. You know, with the news, we see brief news clips that can be cleverly edited at times, but the idea is you don't want to listen to all of this. Let me just show you the part I think is important that you know. And so we are aware of that. Sometimes it's biases. Whenever it's one of those processes where we're aware of who we are. If you want to listen critically and think critically, you've got to think about how you think first of all. And then be aware of maybe some issues you have with understanding because of the vocabulary, because of the topic, because of the resistance that you have. All of that's a part of preparing. What do? Listening is not a passive act, even though sometimes we think it is. I'll just sit here and listen. Listening takes work. It's a doing. It requires cognitive complexities. Cal Newport has called it a part of deep work where it takes some focus. If you're really going to listen, you're really going to have to concentrate, and you're really going to have to take it in, and that can be hard on us. It can be physically demanding. According to Cal Newport, who's written a book called Deep Work, the idea is that it's focused, deep thought, intense. It takes energy to listen. It takes energy to think. If you're thinking about a whole lot of stuff, mentally, you're going to be tired. That's why sometimes reality TV can be a blessing because you can turn it on. You don't have to listen to it. You don't have to pay attention. Nothing's going to happen. But it just allows your brain to stop thinking, especially if you've been working hard that way. And there is some idea that perhaps whenever it comes to that kind of deep work, it takes a while to develop the stamina to do that. There are studies that would suggest that we're only capable of this kind of work for 2 to 3 hours until we learn to train ourselves to be able to do it even more. I mean, if you figure psychiatrists and psychologists and counselors, they have to train themselves to hear and to listen. And yet sometimes even that is difficult. If you go into a doctor's office and the doctor asks you, how are you doing? And you begin to tell them, according to the American Medical Association and the papers that have been written on this, you'll be interrupted by the doctor within 15 to 20 seconds of what you're saying. Because he's not really listening to you, he's listening for something, for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's because he's required to see so many patients a day, and he can't bog that down by taking too much time with one patient. But sometimes the real problem isn't going to be in those 15 or 20 minutes. That's why some things get missed, because there is so much demand to keep pushing things through. For some people, it's easier to do this than others. Some people, and I think in all my classes, or someone, they are people persons. They enjoy being around people. They care about people. They hear people. They want to, well, that personality type tends to be a little bit better in the process of listening because of that care. Others have to work at it a little bit harder. It's not a personality issue. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It just means that everybody has to work at differing levels at different times. And whenever it comes to listening, we tend to have 4 types. This is what the assessment is going to help you understand. What type of a listener are you? Are you an analytical listener? That means you tend to hear people and you try to analyze the problem that you hear that they're talking about. You kind of take the idea, okay, there's something here that I need to help with, something here that's an issue. Let me hear what it is, and I want to fix that. We're going to start from a neutral standpoint, but you want to know what's wrong, and you want to analyze it so you understand. Now, you're probably going to be a good critical listener because you're going to analyze what's been said, but you still have to give yourself the time and the ability to do that. There's also relational listeners. That has to do with kind of that people person orientation. They build connections with people. They understand emotions. They have a grasp for that whenever it comes to in communication. They understand some of those nuances, some of the pauses that may speak a lot into that. Well, they're relational listeners. Okay, there are critical listeners. They're able to judge both the content of the conversation and the reliability of the speaker as well. Is this somebody that I can trust? And they're good critical listeners. They're able to work through what they're being told to see whether or not it's valid or whether it's not. There are task-focused listeners. They tend to shape their conversations toward an effective transfer of important information. What needs to be done? Okay, that's really, you're having a problem with that? Well, that's really, so what can I do? They want to know what they can do. Okay? Some people are more action-oriented. They just are. How can this be put into action? And they're listening for what they can do. Okay? As we said, some people are critical listeners, or content listeners. They want to learn new things. They want to hear new things. They want to know what's essential. What do I need to know? What's going to be on the test? Don't tell me everything. Just tell me what I need to know for the test, for the paper, for whatever the case might be. It's more content-oriented. Okay? Some people are time-oriented listeners. Some of you are going, how long is this video going to last? I mean, I've only got so much time. Well, class lasts for an hour and a half. You got time, trust me. But some people don't waste my time. You got 160 characters, get it done. But there are some things that take a little bit more than that to really understand. Okay? Understanding why you listen and why the people you're speaking to are listening can help you know how to shape a presentation. How you listen, to understand that, is beneficial, but you also have to realize not everybody else listens the same way. So understanding what can you do so that every listening style gets touched upon in some way so they understand this is what's important, this is what's essential, this is what you can do. All of those types of things can be a part of what your preparations involve. What's the list of benefits and drawbacks to the different learning styles? Consider that as you take the assessment, and it tells you kind of what you lean towards. What's the good part of that? What's the bad part of that? Is that what you want? Would you rather be a different kind of listener? What do you think is going to take you? What's it going to take for you to be able to become a better listener in one of these aspects. Critical thinking is not just thinking. Critical listening is not just listening. Critical thinking involves thinking about how you think. This is a nice little thing that's in our textbook by Gerald Neusch. It talks about the CI, if you will. Okay? And in that process, okay, of communicating and thinking through things, what is the state? What does that mean? Okay, let's skip to this one. You define the idea. Okay, this person is saying this. I understand what that means. I'm listening to that. Okay? You give relevant, as you're speaking, state your idea, give the relevant information, offer concrete examples, and paint us a picture. That helps us listen. There's the old acronym, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. Well, simplify it. Understate your idea, define what you're talking about, give the information in your information speeches, give the information, give some concrete examples so they can understand it, and then paint a picture, tell a story. Show an image that will also help in that regard. Sometimes that helps. It's one thing for me to tell you how to drive from here to get into Disneyland and get to the Matterhorn. It's another thing if I draw you a map. Maps can help, and that's part of the illustration aspect. Whenever it comes to critical thinking, you have to be able to recognize the difference between facts and opinions. Whenever you're doing critical listening, you have to listen. What's a fact? What's an opinion? That's part of what we want you to do as you're evaluating some of your classmates' speeches. Okay? Again, recognize that difference. Recognize the difference between the facts and opinions and uncover the assumptions that are expected for you to be making and that you make whenever you hear that. Okay? Whenever they say that, what's my assumption about what they mean? Am I listening to what they truly are trying to communicate? That's part of the vocabulary that can sometimes get in the way of how we speak to one another. Okay, so critical thinking involves recognizing the facts and opinions. How do we understand those different aspects of facts and opinions? Well, facts are verified by clear, unambiguous evidence, and most facts can be tested. So when you're listening to somebody and they make a statement, like I've said in class, peas cause cancer. Canned peas cause cancer. Nobody likes canned peas, really. Okay? But what proof do I have? What facts do I have? Am I assuming, I'm making the assumption, well, you're going to agree with me because nobody likes canned peas, so obviously there's got to be something bad for it. But assumptions about what's going to be in the future can't really be tested in the present. And so sometimes it's difficult when people are making future assumptions to know, is this fact-based? Or are they just kind of assuming what the choice is going to be? And listen, evaluate that as you listen. Okay, recognize the difference between facts and opinions, uncover assumptions, be open to new ideas. That can be a challenge. In 2016, there was a study that was done by the University of Southern California in Los Angeles that discovered something that was really kind of crazy and remarkable. It took a group of people who had strong political views, and it did a scan of their brain as they were being presented with an opposing viewpoint than what they agreed with. Whenever that happened, what they found was that the amygdala in the brain kicked into gear as if they were being threatened by a bear. Okay, if you're threatened by a bear, your brain reacts a certain way. Whenever you are threatened by a new idea, it's not uncommon for you to respond in a fight or flight mentality because it's a new idea and it's a threat. In our world today, not a whole lot of people get threatened by bears, but a lot of people get threatened by new ideas. When you're listening, if you hear a new idea, you may be challenged to the point you don't want to listen. And that's a real challenge, to hear a new idea, something you haven't thought of before. But you're never going to grow if you don't listen to new ideas. You may not count all of them as equal. You shouldn't. Not all new ideas are good, but many are. And we We can't have that biasness against that. We have what is called motivated perceptions. In other words, we're motivated because of our personal beliefs and because of our own ideas and biases and attitudes, that we have that biasness, we have that motivated perception. We're motivated to perceive things that will fit what we expect. So you have to be cautious that you don't get caught up into that. You need to rely on reason and common sense. Of course, the one thing people say about common sense is that it's not that common. Sometimes you wonder about people, but you need to be able to recognize what really does make sense. Is this reasonable? Is it viable? Is it reliable? All of that is a part of what you're trying to communicate within that. Okay? So whenever you're critically thinking, and part of that is critically listening, as you're processing that, recognize the difference between facts and opinions, uncover assumptions, be open to new ideas, rely on reason and common sense, and relate new ideas to old ideas. You hear a new idea, how does it relate to this old idea that I had? Are they compatible? Will they fit together? Or is there something that's causing that to kind of not fit well? Well, what do I need to evaluate? Is it good or is it bad? That's part of the process of critical listening. The last thing is take notes. Whenever you're listening to somebody, don't be afraid to take notes. Now, in a personal conversation or an intimate conversation, it might be kind of hard if you're talking to someone very special and they're telling you about something very important to whip out your cell phone and start taking notes in the notes tab, and that may be a little awkward. But in a lot of other settings, don't be afraid as you're listening to take notes. Not only on what you hear, but on what it causes you to think. Write down questions from what you hear. Write down what's important, but also write down what it causes you to think about. Oftentimes, that's really where the learning can take place, because you're not only hearing what's being said, you're making that application. Write down a question and ask a question which demonstrates you're listening. Part of that is responding. Listening is in many ways a relationship with the presenter. You're listening to somebody and it is a relationship. They say something, you respond. You have the responsibility as a listener to understand how you might need to respond to a presentation. What are they trying to get me to do? Do I think it's a valid point? And that may be some feedback that you can gently give to someone who's sharing something. You need to respond effectively. Think carefully about what was said to understand it and how to respond. Don't just talk off the top of your head. There's not a whole lot on the top of my head, but sometimes we say things we regret because we didn't think about it. Think about what you're going to say. Try to make sure that you say things in kind ways, in supportive ways. You may be challenging somebody, but it doesn't mean that you have to be confrontational and argumentative in the way that you do it. You may not agree, but you can ask a good, solid question without creating conflict or without having the harshness that can come along with it. And the reality is, one of the good keys to good learning, one of the keys to good learning or good listening is good questioning. I can remember growing up, sitting in class going, wow, that's a good question. I didn't think of that. They were listening better than me, probably. And they connected it to something in their life which caused them to create the question. I was just taking in the knowledge. They wanted to know more. How do we do that? Well, think carefully to understand what was said and how to respond. Be kind and generous with your attention. You're giving a gift when you give someone your attention. To be present in the moment. And then respond effectively. Okay? Be aware of the context. What's the purpose of this? Maybe this doesn't really fit me, but I think if this was said to so-and-so, they might really appreciate it. Okay? And the reality is, good listening will become good speaking. This is one of the amazing things. I want you to understand this. You get to help decide whether or not somebody's going to be a good speaker. Research has shown that if people listen to a speaker, if you listen to me whenever I'm talking to you in class, I'll actually be even better because you're listening to me. When you're listening to somebody do a presentation in our class, they'll get better because you're listening to them. It's amazing in that regard. Okay? So let's go ahead and go through the processes or the stages of listening again. 1, you're preparing to listen. Then you're receiving the message through whatever form that comes, whatever medium that is. And then you're going to, as you listen, you're going to understand it, interpret it, so that you can grasp that to some degree. You're going to remember what they're saying so that you can process it. You evaluate it. Does it have really effect? Does it have any meaning in my life? And then you give some feedback. That's all a part of that. And this also is in our textbook. Okay? I like what Winston Churchill once said. He said, courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. It's for some of you in our class, it's getting up to talk in front of the class is going to be courageous. And you deserve to be praised for doing that, especially if you really deal with some real concerns and fears, which we'll be talking about in our next class. But I also like what he went on to say. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. We live in a world in which people don't really want to listen very much. And it creates so many problems. Well, I hope that through this course, even though this is a course on public speaking, it's my hope that you will take the time to learn to listen as well and become critical thinkers, but also being able to critically listen, be able to evaluate the ideas as you hear them. Not just accept them, but to be able to do the evaluation and not just assume things, but to be able to really test those ideas. That all has value. Now, again, I want to remind you, in the notes for this video, you should find a link, or you should find the form that I want to encourage you to take, the assessment, so you can know, are you a rational thinker? Are you, as we talked about earlier, in that process, as you think through different things, what kind of a thinker do you default to? Okay? Do you tend to try to focus on task, on what needs to be done? Do you tend to be able to evaluate ideas and concepts? Being one or the other, and you'll probably be more of a match of different ones, but it's not anything that's a bad thing. But it helps you understand how you listen to people, what you're listening for. And if that's what you're listening for, then you can understand, okay, I need to broaden what I'm listening for to kind of encompass some of these other things. So again, if you become a better listener, you will become a better speaker because you'll understand the people that you're speaking to better. You'll be able to understand their needs. You'll be able to help them see what needs to be done. You'll be able to gain the credibility and reliability that people will want to listen to you. And you'll be able to help change someone's life in numerous ways by what you're able to do by taking the time to listen. So take some time to do the assessment. Post that so I know that you watched the video and that you've done that work. That'll be part of your participation grade. And then if you would, I want to make sure that you turn that in so that I can make sure that you're there. And then I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday, whenever we'll have the opportunity to talk about how to speak confidently and not have stage fright or the fear that comes with public speaking. There are so many different little things you can do that'll help you with that, and I want to help guide you through that. So thank you for taking the time. I know watching a video of somebody talking without any animation or anything can be really difficult, and this is kind of an interesting situation for me on this side as well, but I look forward to seeing you again in class on Wednesday, and hope that you continue to enjoy your college experience as we're getting started this way. Thank you very much. Have a good day.